Welcome on this beautiful day to the fall webinar presented by Grandmothers Against Gun Violence Foundation. I'm Cindy Jackson, current chair of the foundation. One of the foundation's goals is to highlight the research findings of the scholars that we have funded. Today's presentation with Elizabeth Weybright and Ashley Hernandez Hall are part of the will give us an insight into the future of gun violence prevention and intervention through their research. Today, the presentation will be about 30 minutes. After that, they'll be followed by a 15-minute question and answer period. As you look at your screen, you'll notice that your chat will be disabled, but yet your question and answers will be open. I encourage you to submit questions during the presentation so that they will be ready for the following of the presentation. We also understand that this will be recorded for presentation at a later time and for you to look at it and share it with your friends through our new Facebook page. So it's looking important that we're going to be ready for today. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Kay Beisse, who's co-chair of the Education Committee, and she will introduce our presenters and present a context for the presentation today. Kay?
Thank you, Cindy. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two featured speakers today. And I'll start with Elizabeth Weybright, who is Associate Professor in Human Development at Washington State University. And Elizabeth has really some extensive background in prevention science, that is the prevention of harms, both social and health harms. And also she's been involved in the youth development program through 4-H at Washington State University. So the second presenter, Ashley Hall, is a colleague of Elizabeth's, and Ashley has also graduate training. Her background is in social work, and she has been working extensively in the community in youth development programs focused on promoting mental health and also preventing suicide. So to provide some context, I'd like to ask both of you. Both of you have backgrounds that are somewhat related but unrelated specifically to gun violence and its prevention. So how did you get interested, or why did you get interested in gun violence research specifically? Elizabeth, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I come from as you mentioned, prevention science background, and mostly that has looked at substance use prevention. And the benefit of a prevention science background is it really gives you a lens to look at any health outcome that you like. So I had historically been looking at adolescent alcohol use or cannabis use or opioid use. And so it brings a lovely framework to look at risk factors and prevention factors related to, in this case, firearm injury and related harms. The other piece is I had this lovely connection at University of Washington, and when they were thinking about applying for a project, they reached out. So Kevin Haggerty is retired though from University of Washington, and we each share a prevention background, and so we connected about needing to connect in or reach into rural communities, and so that was part of how this partnership came about, and the other kind of networking impetus for it.
That's great. How about you, Ashley?
Yeah, so my background in social work, I really focused a lot on community engagement, on working at the macro level instead of the individual level. So extension, 4-H, all of this kind of worked really well with me. And the reason I got in this particular area was really from the community need. So community need and mental health, especially around youth and suicide prevention. And that naturally, at least for me, led to firearm injury prevention. Firearms are one of the leading mechanisms for suicide, and it's getting to be a little bit, it's kind of increasing there with our youth population. So it was a very natural, helpful, and kind of honestly on a personal level, it felt like something I could actually do to help start, helping this population, preventing injury and death in this particular population. I'm also fortunate that I was able to step in and start to manage the shooting sports program for the 4-H youth development program for the entire state of Washington. So that allowed me this really unique opportunity to guide education and training for the folks who are actually using firearms recreationally. So with suicide prevention, safe storage, it's just been a really unique position to be in, to both do the research in this area, but also have direct access to the population that's engaging with firearms.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So to provide a little more context, I'd like each of you to think about, well, most of our supporters of the foundation, our board members are located here in the western region of the state and are really understanding of the other half of the state can be quite limited. So why should we in the urban, suburban areas of the state care about or pay attention to issues and challenges related to gun violence in rural areas of the state?
Yeah, that's a good question. I grew up in the Midwest, where in a given state you have upwards of 90 plus counties. And then I came here to Washington and we have 39 counties and a much larger landmass. So I would argue within each county, there are rural spaces. Even if you're in King County, you can find a rural place within your county. So even as thinking of community members, those neighbors are not that far from us.
Aha.
The other piece for me of why should we care about rural if we're in an urban setting is that there are 100% some unique characteristics of rural settings, and I'll actually talk about that in the presentation in a moment. And we know some of these things operate the same way. The way that risk and protection work for adolescent gun violence, for adolescent suicide, some of those elements are the same. Now, the community clearly has an influence and can shape some of that, but those connections between parenting, between social connections and social support, education, they are present whether you are in an urban or a rural setting.
Very good. Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Ashley?
I mean, that was a pretty good description. I will say that in my role as a youth development educator, I really like to look at our youth as kind of experts in their worlds, and firearm ownership is a little bit higher in the rural areas. Folks engage with firearms in a different way. So if we start to look at these folks as experts in this area, they can help give us a really unique perspective on how to then go further and engage with other firearm owners, whether they be rural or urban, on like what kind of messaging is going to work when it comes to trying to convince people to store firearms safely. What kind of engagement is going to work? Plus, especially for me, again, I'm focused on the youth population. Those rural youth might become urban youth one day or urban adults one day. So it just makes sense in that area. But these are just unique, wonderfully generous individuals. So I really enjoy learning from them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to turn the screen over to the two of you and ask that you present not only a description of your project and how it fits in with the broader work in gun violence in rural communities, but also some of the findings. And I'm going to really encourage our audience to ask questions. This is your opportunity to really go in deeper to this issue. And if you cannot think of a question, send us a comment or maybe something that you want to remember from today's session that you would want to share with friends or family or other advocates of gun violence prevention. So I'll be looking at the Q&A towards the end of the presentation, and we'll try to address your questions and comments later.
All right, and with that, I think you should be seeing the full slide. So it's an honor to be here today and to be here with Ashley to talk about firearm safety practices of rural families within the state of Washington. And obviously we don't do this work alone. So I do have a couple of acknowledgements. We had some amazing bachelor's level social work students, Cassie and Adonis, who helped us collect data and analyze data. And then we had some consultants, Doctors Allison Miller and Mark Zimmerman from University of Michigan, as well as Dr. Ali Rohani from University of Washington. And again, just broader thanks to WSU Extension and 4-H Youth Development. I will say we have a QR code for the project website, and we'll put that back up at the end, but we're really intentional about sharing findings with the public or with those that we spoke to. So on this website, you will see publications as well as one-pagers, updates, research briefs, things like that. So firearms are the leading cause of death for adolescents within the United States, and in particular, injury death. The figure that you're seeing on the screen shows the 5 leading causes of injury death for 11 to 18-year-olds, spanning from 2001 to 2022. I really want to bring your attention to this particular point. And this is when firearms surpassed motor vehicle accidents as the leading cause of injury death within 2017. Clearly, while we have been doing a much better job of keeping adolescents safe from cars and reducing motor vehicle accidents, we have not been doing as well of a job in keeping them safe from firearms. This figure actually is from a study we just published last month. And although I'm not going to walk through all the findings, it is available and I'm happy to share it if you reach out. I want to point out one surprising finding. We separated this 11 to 18-year-old age group into middle school age and high school age, and then whether they lived in rural or urban areas. And one surprising finding was how we've seen a steep increase in firearm homicide deaths among high school age students or adolescents. And this actually applied in both urban and rural areas. But we do know there are some distinctions about rural settings. So what's so different or what's going on within rural areas? Well, rural areas have a lot of unique features. I mean, density to people, distance to large cities, those are the two we often think of. But there's a clear connection between work and play and the natural environment. And that natural environment is often central to someone's identity. Now, when it comes to rural settings and firearms, there was this editorial, and you're seeing a screenshot of it on the slide, from 2020 by Alison Kuliba, and she called for greater research on rural adolescents, and I really loved the title of this paper. And actually, since then, we've seen a growing body of research on this population, and it tells an interesting story. So we have historically thought of firearms as an urban problem, but that's not necessarily the case. When it comes to handguns, for example, rural adolescents have higher rates of handgun carrying than urban, and we've seen steeper increases in those rates over time. Living in a rural setting, adolescents are more likely to have a firearm present in the home and to have earlier access to firearms, again, than their urban or suburban counterparts. Now, collectively, this places them at greater risk for firearm-related injuries and harm. We know that access is a key precursor to carrying, which is a key risk factor for injury. At the same time, firearms play a really important social, cultural, family role within rural communities. This can be for hobby or recreation, for hunting or subsistence, and just as a shared identity or a shared family activity. Now, this combination of risk and culture led us to complete a prior study with rural adolescents. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that. Excuse me, I jumped ahead. Funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we conducted a mixed methods study of rural adolescents in Washington State. And we recruited them, Ashley and I did this together, from the 4-H Youth Development Program, which has a presence in every Washington county and on some reservations. In the study, we did an interview or focus group, and before that, we had them complete a survey. And we reached about 93 youth. The picture you're seeing here is actually one of the sites of one of our focus groups. We did put chairs in it. They didn't have to sit on hay bales. But as you can see, we showed up in spaces where youth were. Ashley held focus groups at a shooting sports event. And I don't want to take all of our time today to dive into those findings, but I do want to kind of give you a main takeaway of that. So the main takeaway is that generally what we found in our study is that rural adolescents we spoke to engaged with firearms in a culturally appropriate and developmentally appropriate pro-social way. This means that they understood the rules around when they can and cannot use a firearm. They understood that they are not allowed or it's not acceptable to carry a firearm within a public space, and they advocated they should have proper training. They also acknowledged that adults do different things and that there's a small group of adolescents that do things that they know they're not supposed to do. This is what we also know from the literature. But they know that adults can't carry in public, and they do, at least they do within their communities. We've published these findings, and again, happy to share some of this research. But critical to doing this work, to showing up in this barn or showing up in communities, was our partnership with Extension and 4-H, including Ashley as the shooting sports director or coordinator. So not only did we leverage the humans or the personnel that existed, but also their relationships as trusted messengers in the community to recruit adolescents, gather parent permission, collect data, and interpret findings. This is all part of what we're calling a participatory process. And we talked about this in our paper about how we engaged a community-based organization, in particular 4-H, and it was a true partnership from getting the funding to figuring out what's happening in the communities, to designing the study, and now to disseminating. And I'm excited because now we're actually on to the next project, which is what we're going to talk about today. So all of that understanding of what are adolescents in rural settings saying really made us to want to continue. We had more questions that we wanted to answer, and that's where the funding from Grandmothers Against Gun Violence Foundation came in. We wanted to understand these firearm safety practices of the families in Washington State, but this time we want to talk to the parents. So we leveraged all of those relationships in the adolescents we had before, and we reached out to the parents of those adolescents to chat with them. And I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes kind of orienting you to our study and our study design, and then start us off with some of the results around firearm storage definitions, ideals, and actual practices of our participants. So we conducted interviews to explore participants' perceptions and their practices related to firearm storage. It's important to note here that qualitative research, like our study here, it's not really intended to generalize to all of Washingtonians or all firearm owners. Instead, it provides this rich, detailed description, and that helps us understand the nuances surrounding firearm storage behaviors. So it's something to keep in mind as you're watching this. So now to describe the study, we did some interviews, of course, with our participants around these three topics that you see on the screen: household firearm ownership and storage, family practices, and mental health considerations. With household firearm ownership and storage, we ask questions like, where and how are handguns stored? Same question for long guns. Are they stored in secured lock or safe? A lot of follow-up questions if needed. Are they stored loaded? Are they stored with ammunition? In the family practices section, we ask questions like, how does managing firearms look in your family? How does it work? How are these practices different for adolescents? And we also followed up with questions about mental health considerations. So what do we think about, or what do our participants feel about firearm safety in the context of a mental health challenge or a mental health crisis? And would their practices, their management of firearms, change in those situations? Now, I want to kind of set the stage just by defining what our industry is telling us is secure and safe storage of firearms. So on the next slide here, oh, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. This is our study. This is the quick kind of rundown of who we actually talked to. So again, Elizabeth said we talked to 93 students in the previous study. That is a fantastic number, and it was incredibly fun to do. The parents of that study, we had about 73 eligible parents from that adolescent study. We sent about 189 emails and then follow-up emails and more follow-up emails. And then we also made personal phone calls afterward to try to recruit as many participants as possible. We had some folks that we had to exclude because of a variety of reasons. We had folks who specifically declined to participate. And then we did have some folks sign up but then not show up. And ultimately, we ended up with 24 unique interviews in this study. Okay, now back to what I was accidentally going forward, because this is kind of an exciting part. We want to talk about what secure storage actually is. And that's kind of a tricky question, but this the triple secure storage method is touted as an effective way to store firearms in homes to prevent unintended injury and death. So this is in multiple studies, and it is used in a lot of different graphics. If you've gotten any flyers or anything like that, you might have seen this similar graphic or something like it to kind of teach us how to store firearms securely. It involves making sure that a firearm is fully unloaded, that the firearm itself is locked up so it can't be accessed by folks who shouldn't have access, and that the ammunition for that firearm is separate and also locked up. So that's our triple secure storage method. So what did we find? And that's what's in the research, that's what's in several studies. And what did we find in our study is incredibly interesting. First, let me orient you to this slide and this table. We're going to be looking at this for the next several slides. On the left here, that column, those are the secure storage practices. So those are actually the different types of things that might occur in a storage of a firearm. So either the firearm is unsecured and not being secured in any way, it's unloaded, it's locked, its ammunition is separate, or the ammunition is actually locked. That top row there, those are the questions we ask. So we ask folks to define secure storage for us towards the beginning of the interview. We coded these responses for secure storage features or having it unsecured. An important note here, if folks had more than one firearm, they may have had different practices for each firearm in their home. So we counted them each separately, which is one of the reasons you're going to notice that the totals in the columns are actually more than 100%. Same with definitions. Some folks mentioned multiple features of secure storage in their definitions, so those were counted separately, leading to more than 100%. Okay, well, let's look here at the definition. Again, we asked folks to define secure storage for us. What did they think secure storage was? As you can see in this, 100% of our participants, all 24, said the firearm is locked. That's secure storage to them. Zero mention of ammunition being stored separately or ammunition being locked. Zero mention of ammunition at all. And there were a few folks who mentioned making sure the firearm itself was unloaded. Then we have, how are those folks actually storing their firearms? So again, we asked the definition of storage, secure storage, early in the interview. Then we asked about firearms they own and how those are stored in their home. So how do those definitions compare to how the firearms are actually being stored is really interesting. So there's more secure storage practices related to handguns. However, some did keep a handgun unsecured. And that might be in a different location, like one handgun is secured in the house, another one is maybe unsecured in a vehicle. They also could have multiple handguns stored in a variety of different ways, and long guns stored in a variety of different ways. So that indicates that folks have this mix of both secure and unsecure practices within the same home. Again, that nuance and those details in qualitative studies are very interesting. Now looking at the next couple of questions, we asked them what they feel like should happen in a home to secure firearms safely. How should firearms be stored in homes with youth? So these definitions are a little bit different than the suggested practices or their definition of storage, which again, really interesting from a research perspective. We saw less secure storage practices noted when discussing storage in homes with youth. Often, they provided us some qualifiers, like maybe a youth needs access to protect the home from animals or for personal protection, or maybe if the youth was trusted or had been trained in firearms. So it wasn't just a yes, no kind of a thing that you would see from a survey, they provided us some kind of rich detail there. And then looking at the table as a whole, we can have look at some key takeaways here. Locking a firearm was by far the most noted practice across all questions. Locking ammunition, however, not really a standard practice either in definition, ideal, or actual practice. There are inconsistencies across those definitions, ideals, and behaviors. And these inconsistencies are incredibly helpful to understand because these, at least for us, for folks in this field, these are points for intervention. So these inconsistencies are some of the most exciting discoveries from this study. This study also brings up a couple of questions, especially when looking at the triple secure storage method. Is there a piece or are there pieces of the triple secure storage that are more critical? Is it sufficient to store a firearm locked, like these responses in our study indicate? Or do we truly need all three practices to achieve the safest storage possible? It's a great question for future research. Now let's move on to the family management practices in homes. This is, again, a really interesting area, and I'm going to turn that back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you. So if any of you have an adolescent in the home or remember what it was like to have an adolescent in the home, despite what it may have felt like or what it may seem, parents still remain a key influence in adolescents' lives. And the family management practices that parents employ really serve to shape an adolescent's behavior. So there's a couple key family management practices that I want to introduce, and then we'll tell you what we found in our study. One is parental monitoring and behavior management. And this includes parental behaviors, obviously, toward the adolescent that are really intended to track where are you, who are you with, what are you doing, track the whereabouts of the adolescent, to set rules and expectations for behavior and appropriate behavior, and to supervise or guide the adolescent to prevent any potential problem behavior. Parental support and emotional support, again, it looks at this quality of interaction between the adolescent and the parent and includes things like responsiveness to a child's need or an adolescent's need, use of encouragement, praise, affection, those kinds of things. One of the questions that came up was, it wasn't really clear how parenting practices are related to firearms and how they're decided on. Doesn't feel enough to know what you're doing, but how did you get to doing that in the first place? So this is the focus of our next set of findings. The first finding is that when parents talked about family management practices, it was very much intergenerational. They came from a family of origin and predominantly from males. This is actually an interesting finding that overlaps with what we heard from the adolescents that we've spoke with previously. And this is where we get to bring in participant voice. I'm going to share a bunch of quotes with you of what participants said directly. So one participant said, "My family are hunters. My dad, my uncles, all my brothers were just growing up around guns." And another one talked about this transmission of knowledge, about how they learned their practices. And this person said, "I think it was through my husband, and that it was the way he grew up. And my dad was in law enforcement." I know we've selected examples that have all males, but it was easy to pick from because they're generally talking about learning from parents, grandparents, some sort of male relative. So a key piece is practices are often passed down. The other piece is that family management is often limited to the parents. Now, we do think of parents setting and enforcing rules within a home, especially for toddlers, for children. But as we move into adolescence, there's often more of a negotiation. As adolescents want more autonomy and freedom, parents have to start talking about, okay, when are you expected to be home? And sometimes there's a back and forth about those rules or a changing of those rules. In our sample, though, about 75% of respondents said, "My child does not play an active role in firearm-related storage practices." So I'll give you a pretty succinct quote of this, where a parent said, "Zero. This is not a negotiation. This is mom and dad saying this is how it rolls. This is what we do." I do have a second quote that I'll just read to you that talked about accommodating or accounting for how adolescents change over time. This person or parent said, "Initially, it was, if you were taking the gun somewhere, I, as a parent, I am going with it. I'm responsible. But yeah, as they've gotten older, they've said, you know, we need a little more freedom than that. So it's open to negotiation. So you can see how this parent and adolescent interaction has kind of changed over time, in particular related to storage practices. The other piece is there are some clear rules that parents have for adolescents when it comes to firearms. Again, this is another place where it overlapped nicely with our adolescent findings that adolescents clearly knew rules about firearms. The most frequently mentioned rule was do not touch, don't touch. And parents actually had kind of conditions or when pieces that they wanted to elaborate on this don't touch. They talked about do not touch without adult supervision, and about 62% said that. Other things they said were do not touch without a purpose, such as self-protection or hunting. Do not touch due to the danger, that there's a danger to you or there is a danger to someone else that someone could get hurt. And the final do not touch was do not ever touch. And if you ever see a firearm, get an adult. And that's kind of the end of the story. I want to give you a quote related to this. The rules have always been that our son isn't allowed to touch them or go near them without our presence. So an adult needs to be present for the adolescent to use or engage with the firearm. So we have the practices, we have adolescent engagement, we have clear rules. The next question is, how do adolescents get those rules? How are these rules transmitted from parents to adolescents? And so they really emphasized education, that they were educating through parental modeling themselves, that I'm going to show you, I'm going to instruct you in what the practices are, or I'm going to give you some formal education. And 4-H shooting sports would be a piece of that formal education. When parents were giving instruction, it was primarily on how to handle the firearm safely. And this is a longer quote, so I'm going to read it to you. But this parent said, so the rules would be always ensure the firearm is unloaded before you were to pick it up and carry it. You'd always point it in a safe direction, always maintain finger off the trigger, and don't point it at anything unless you intend to shoot. So essentially, whether you want to call it the standard universal gun rules or NRA gun rules, it's always followed in the house. I think there were 4 always, alwayses in that quote. There's a clear kind of black and white of what the rules are in this. And this parent quote brings us both the parent instruction as well as alignment with their perceptions of kind of standard practices or the practices that they're looking for or going to. So when we think about this at a broader level, and we're looking at this across findings of how are folks storing and how are parents learning about and transmitting this information to adolescents, kind of what are these main takeaways and what does this look like? Well, we have kind of 4 things I want to talk through. We've had considerable success being in communities and talking with communities just to get this information. We know that when it comes to rural settings, the things that work in an urban setting cannot simply be picked up and dropped into a rural setting, that's not going to work. And it's almost even worse to bring a program that feels like a poor fit, like, oh, the people that made this program clearly don't understand us and what is important to us. It may backfire at that point and people won't want to pay any attention at all. So it's almost worse to do that than potentially to do nothing at all. So it's going to be critical to be working in communities and to be working with communities to find solutions that feel feasible, that feel relevant for the people, the agencies, the organizations that are there. And we did some of this work successfully with trusted partners like 4-H. Community-driven approaches are going to be equally as important. We see a lot of community violence interrupters within urban areas or healthcare provider-based approaches within hospital systems or clinics. But in rural settings, community-based approaches are really going to be effective. And we have some evidence that this works. And so I apologize I forgot to put this slide, or excuse me, the reference on the screen. But some of the work that we've done with Dr. Rohani looks at a community-based prevention system and how that actually serves to reduce, that community-based intervention system is delivered in childhood and how that works longer term to reduce handgun carrying in adolescents. So we can have these downstream effects from prevention programs. The reason I'm focused on prevention is that Firearm injuries and deaths are 100% preventable. These are things that we can actually stop. Ashley already alluded to this or mentioned this, but in other projects, we have seen how youth have been a source for influence and change within a family. One of the first projects I got to do, and actually maybe you were involved in this, Ashley, is where we had teens teach younger youth a nutrition education curriculum. And we evaluated the teen as teen teachers. And what we found was really interesting, that not only did they have to learn a nutrition education curriculum to teach it to the younger youth, but they also brought it into their homes and they started adopting those nutrition behaviors to feel in alignment with what they're advocating for others. So we heard wonderful stories of families changing their eating practices, of teens advocating for a housing authority to change their food offerings in the vending machine of a community room. So youth have a voice and they have a say, and they are powerful agents for change. If you've ever engaged with a teenager about something they are passionate about, you have seen this in action. And we can leverage this for community change. We have done projects like that before. Now, from the parent perspective, it kind of sounds like these rules may be inflexible, at least for some of those parents. So understanding how best to bring an adolescent voice will be really important. And ultimately, we need to understand how those most impacted have a say in the solutions. And we need to make sure that they are at the table and that adults are engaging in a respectful way. So a lot of work to be done or to continue being done about bringing youth into the conversation and elevating their voice for a change when it comes to reducing firearm injury and death. You know, you heard from Ashley about these inconsistencies and sometimes lesser storage practices, where parents were saying, well, when I trust my adolescent, that's when I give them greater access. These are amazing points of intervention and teaching tools like she mentioned. We can see ways forward to highlight these as case studies or examples in future messaging to promote secure storage. And the intention here isn't to shame anyone or say, hey, you haven't been doing triple secure storage, what's going on here? But it's really more to humanize that these are challenging decisions and these are very personal decisions. And there may be an ebb and flow to some of these decisions. So I'll give you a quick example of that. We know that during hunting season, you may be more likely to bring a firearm home and leave it out before you clean it. And we actually heard that specific example. She wasn't hunting, but a parent said their daughter had just come up from an event and there was a long gun laying on the kitchen table because it needed to be cleaned before it got put away. These are amazing little examples of where there are lesser secure practices happening in the home, but we can use this as stories. And hey, walk me through what you do when you bring your long gun home from an event. And what are these points for or considerations we should have as we make some decisions, as we wait for it to be cleaned, as we put it away. There's also a great opportunity for alignment with policies that are coming in Washington. One of the most powerful ways you can have influence, right, is by policymaking and changing policy. In Washington state, for example, we have a new firearm purchaser licensing law or a permit to purchase law. This will be effective as of May 2027, and it will require completion of a firearm safety course and a live fire training before purchasing a firearm. This really presents an opportunity to bring what we've learned to these safety courses, and we're exploring what a partnership could look like and how can we provide support and engage within rural settings. Now, I would like to add one final quote that we heard from a participant, who was really speaking to this kind of nuance of rural settings. So this participant said, I would just love to be able to have firearms carry a story that says it is more than just the headlines you see on the news of the mass shootings. And I'm going to continue this quote, but I just couldn't put it all on the screen. I would just love to be able to see where the discussion is not about the anomalies, but about the thousands of us who are doing it right. And from my perspective, this quote points out how there are folks who are committed to keeping individuals safe when it comes to firearms. And What an amazing foundation to work from, to know that there are folks in communities who hold this value and importance of safety and responsibility that we can work with, that we can jointly share those values and promote safety, as particularly for adolescents. This is an amazing place, a starting point for a place where we kind of have the same goal in mind, and let's get there together. So with that, I'm going to go to our last slide. And on the screen, you'll see our email address. Please feel free to reach out. And I put that QR code back up for our project-based webpage where you can find some of our studies. And we're happy to move on to the Q&A portion and answer some questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. You gave us a lot to chew on here. I want to pause for a second and encourage the audience to submit your questions and comments to the Q&A section. And while you're doing that, I'm going to offer some of my own questions. I found myself really interested in this triple method of safe storage and how that fits or doesn't fit in the context of rural families. So did you get a sense of why the locked firearm that may be loaded seems acceptable as a safe measure, and why ammunition stored securely didn't seem to be important at all? Did you get any kind of understanding of that?
Elizabeth, you want me to start? You can add what I forget. Okay. First, I will say that we didn't, preface the interview with a triple safe storage method, right? So they weren't going into it knowing that this is what is considered like a standard safe practice. So, and I am curious about what would have happened if we did that. But really, I think there's a few things at least that were kind of hinted at in the study, and I think we've seen in other research as well. One, having an unloaded, inaccessible handgun is not useful as a protection tool. So they kind of talked about needing quick, easy access in the situation, if the situation arose, they would have to protect their home or their family. So, having a gun in a locked safe and then the ammunition in the next room locked in another area basically kind of nullifies the protection aspect of the firearm. So I think that's one kind of area, especially with the handguns. Ammunition, I think there were several people that it just seemed like it wasn't practical to have it in a separate space. As far as space goes, having another safe, or if we just simply don't have room to put it somewhere else. So another thing that came up, I think, several times was, well, it's safer to have the ammunition in the locked safe than unsecured in the closet somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So, just the practicalities of having multiple secure locations within a home. It's not always practical.
I would be interested, Ashley, in what the rural parents think about this as a definition of safe storage and whether they think of it as doable. I often hear that easy access, ready access for protection is a big deal. And it may be one of the main reasons for keeping a gun in the home. So I would love to see more research and maybe more pressure on gun manufacturers to solve that problem.
I will add that some people did kind of come with like, I know the ammunition should be stored separately. So they had heard at some point, they had heard that. It wasn't that they were completely ignorant of triple secure storage. And interestingly, throughout the interviews, different types of practices would come up that they're like, oh, well, I guess that one time we left this out, or, well, there is that one shotgun under the bed. So it was the variety of storage practices and the variety of reasons for the different storage practices was probably the most interesting part of the conversations.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I see that we have some questions coming in, so I'm going to refer to them. I'll read this one. Growing up in a rural area, I saw that guns were mainly thought of as a tool, not as a way to solve conflicts. Would you say that is part of what rural adolescents can teach us about gun safety?
Yeah, I can get started, and then Ashley, please chime in. For our prior study, when we talked with adolescents, and we actually did this with the parents too, we asked them to define a few terms because we realized we were going to be talking about terms like carrying, and we might not all have the same definition for these terms. So in particular, the reason I'm thinking of this for this question is we asked them to define firearm. What does it mean to have a firearm? And one of the features of a response was a tool. And so that definitely came up in some of the adolescent responses. You know, I think you're bringing up a great point of how do we engage with conflict? And I'll be transparent that our study findings didn't necessarily speak to how and when adolescents, and I'm thinking of the prior study as well as the current, you know, how do parents talk about using a firearm related to a conflict setting? And the adolescents didn't necessarily bring that up either. The closest piece I can think of is a small percentage of them, as in like one of them, I think, had carried a firearm to school recently. And otherwise, overwhelmingly, the adolescents that we spoke with in the previous study were saying, we know it is not appropriate for us to take a firearm to school. And so I think that's one of the pieces that has been looked at about kind of addressing conflicts within a school setting. But Ashley, what's your thought as well?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything. I mean, conflict, or at least in the context of, you know, these friction points, these challenges that arise in our lives, did come up at least in a kind of a adjacent way. I mean, using a firearm for self-protection. You know, somebody coming into your home when you don't want them in there, they don't belong there. Also, conflict with the environment, whether it be a predator animal when we have livestock in our home and things like that. It did come up at least a couple, I would say maybe 3 times, you know, that sometimes a youth might need to access a firearm in those situations. However, I will say that the parents, at least in our study, were very adamant that their youth do not resort to, you know, weapons, guns, knives, or anything like that. That it's more like call mom or dad or get dad, or you know, instead. So it was, you know, helpful to hear that from them, but they also recognize that firearms are used in conflict intentionally for things like protecting our animals or protecting our homes. So whether or not that translates to specific rules or even trainings for youth, I think that remains to be seen.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's another question then. In your last quotation, the speaker seemed to imply that gun violence isn't so much about guns as about resorting to violence. Is there research that examines this idea? That's sort of the question. It's related to what we just talked about. This question is, well, guns aren't the problem. It's the purpose or the use of the guns that becomes the problem.
Yeah, when we think in particular of suicide, one of the aspects of suicide completion is easy access, in this case, easy access to a firearm. So how quickly accessible is a firearm to me in these moments of crisis? And we know that the more distance, as in the more time you can give between my moment of crisis and my ability to access a firearm, the longer the more likely you are to delay injury and death.
Yeah.
The other element of this, when we talk about adolescents and parents, is that sometimes there is a disconnect, and we didn't ask this in the current study, but this has come from other research, between what the parents think the adolescent knows or can access and what the adolescent can actually access. There's been some interesting studies that basically say adolescents know more than parents think they do, and they can often access a firearm faster than parents realize they can. And again, that distance piece is going to be really important in times of crisis, whether that is suicide or whether that is kind of resorting to other types of violence as well.
Yeah.
I don't know, Ashley, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to take the suicide angle too. That's the area that mental health and suicide prevention is really where I focus. But there is some research out there on, firearm presence in road rage incidents, escalating those situations to be a little bit more intense, domestic violence as well. So the presence of those firearms um, definitely adds a component of risk. And that's just what we know. I think the important thing that our participant was trying to say is that these are like awful examples of things that we hope don't happen anymore, or at least I hope don't happen anymore. But also there's a lot of examples of more responsible ownership.
Very nice. Thank you. Another audience participant would love to hear more about gender in gun violence and gun safety practices. Did you pick up on any differences in the youth or the parent respondents?
Mine's gonna be quick, Elizabeth, and you can take over. Me too. No, we didn't study that specifically. I'm very interested in that too. I think that our youth participants were a great mix of genders. I don't know that we asked any questions that even got at that though. Elizabeth, maybe in our previous one that you can think of.
No, like we shared before, gender really came out in where these practices came from. And often in the adolescent sample, we asked them about the last time they carried a handgun or used a long gun, tell me about it. And a lot of the people that were present, there were males and females, but again, predominantly males. So although we had a great mix of gender in the youth responses, the parents were predominantly female. I will say that. So I think it's interesting. I'm not surprised from a research perspective that we heard from mothers and not fathers. And it's interesting that the default or the way the information comes down is through husbands, through fathers, grandfathers, etc. So there is a really interesting gender interaction with that and a lot of other pieces. I agree with this comment and question, and I think it's an important one. Yes, we do need to understand more, and yes.
Well, I see from the clock that we're nearing the end of our Q&A time, but I wanted to just highlight, I hope that this comes through to our audience, that this particular project really does represent some of the best foundational work in research on gun violence in rural communities. And we see a bright future in that work in the participation of these two researchers. And I'd like you to close, Elizabeth, and perhaps Ashley, with what are your next steps? If you had unlimited resources, which you don't have, but if you did, what would be the agenda that you would want to see and be a part of in this type of research?
So I'm happy to share, and then I'm curious to hear your perspective, Ashley. A model that I'm familiar with is this. In Washington State, we do a lovely job of funding under-resourced communities from a coalition perspective to have a process of identifying needs, identifying programs that can address those needs, and then delivering those. Now, we know that there are some what we call shared risk and protective factors that for an adolescent, a program might not only reduce substance use long-term, but it also might reduce handgun carrying, for example. So we know there are some of these things programs can achieve multiple purposes, but I would love to have a community coalition model and to test that out, particularly and specifically related to firearms within a rural setting. Kind of that's my, at least, dream at the moment.
Yeah. I imagine you'll have many takers from other disciplines and other fields of research. So that's great to hear. Ashley, how about you?
I'm going to embarrassingly admit that I was trying to answer a question on here, and I was hoping Elizabeth's answer would help me understand your question better, but I need you to restate the question.
Oh, that's okay. I was just asking about your vision for next steps. What would you like to see build on the results of these two studies?
Yeah, I think already some of the stuff that Elizabeth said for sure, but I think recognizing that this is a problem. Firearm injury and death is a problem that we can't tackle with one solution or even one prevention. It can't be doctors, it can't be nurses, it can't be psychologists. It has to be all of us. And engaging those communities, I think, is going to be by far the most powerful. So for me, it's really figuring out what is the most effective way to engage with these communities in the most succinct and powerful way. And if that's a social media post or a special training or a flyer with every gun purchase, sure, great. So my hope for this is that it'll lead to us figuring out really quick, easy ways to reach gun owners. This isn't, gun ownership isn't reducing. It isn't going away. Even if not a single gun was sold starting today on, there's still going to be more guns in this country and households than anywhere else. So how do we get that information as quickly as possible to folks? And I think we're already seeing that the gun owners themselves are willing and enthusiastic participants in solving this problem. So continuing to engage those gun owners as experts in this world is what I hope to see.
Your project is a really great example of that. And so we're going to be watching the two of you and what happens in your work. And I encourage the audience to go to your website. It's really a great example of how to disseminate research in a way that people can understand and use. So thanks to the both of you, and I'll turn it back to Cindy.
Thank you, Kay, and special thanks for the passionate presentation of Elizabeth and Ashley. The insight and the importance of your work was definitely demonstrated, and I know that our audience is intrigued and will want more and encourage them to do that. I also want to thank you, Kay, again, and J-Trap for our tech support. So, of course, audience, they have to thank you. Without your support, is valuable to all of us. It is valuable to the funding of our researchers. And as we know, that this time in our country is a challenge when it comes to supporting research regarding firearms and prevention of gun violence. So without federal research supporting the firearm-related research like you heard today, there will be limited understanding for policymakers and practitioners to use to apply. And that has been one of the goals of our funding, is to make sure that the research that we fund is useful for communities and policymakers. Thus, the work of the foundation, with the support of our donors, we play an important role in supporting the future of our researchers and the future of research that can be applied in all of our communities. The scholars rely on us, and we're hoping that you'll see through what we've presented today the importance of the work of scholars in this particular field. So, and the other part of what we're doing is, what's up next for us? Well, as you know, we fund projects yearly, and in the spring, we'll have a webinar with the researchers that will be submitting projects for requests this winter. And I also want to encourage you to follow us on Facebook. We've added this so that we can support the researchers and support information that they share with our audience and with donors. And especially, this is important as for those of us who weren't able to come today, to see how to read the recording of this research. So again, thanks to our presenters, thanks to the audience for the belief in the work that we do and its importance. So thank all of you again as we move on through this journey, and may you have a great day. Thank you.